They served her a slice of stale bread and a glass of piss-warm water on a $100,000 contract flight. They thought she was just another charity case who'd somehow slipped through the cracks into the rarefied air of first class. They had no fucking idea they just declared war on a titan. What you're about to hear is a story of what happens when the powerless try to humiliate the powerful, and the world is forced to watch the consequences. It's a story of quiet rage and corporate annihilation. So buckle up, hit that subscribe button, and ring the notification bell, because you are not going to want to miss a single brutal second of this. The low, guttural hum of the twin Rolls-Royce engines on Apex Air Flight 788 was a constant, a mechanical mantra thrumming through the floor into the soles of $1,000 shoes. This was the Midnight Express from New York to Geneva, a steel tube filled with the 1%, hurtling through the stratosphere at 600 miles per hour. Inside the first-class cabin, the world was a cocoon of muted luxury. Cream-colored leather pods, each a private universe of comfort, lined the fuselage. The air, scrubbed and recycled, smelled faintly of roasted duck and expensive perfume. Everything was designed to whisper a single seductive word: exclusivity. For most, it was a whisper. For the woman in seat 2B, it was about to become a goddamn battlefield. Dr. Eris Thorne sat with a stillness that was both unnerving and magnetic. At 42, she commanded a presence that didn't need volume. Decades spent clawing her way to the top of rooms dominated by pale, stale men had forged her composure into something akin to a diamond, impossibly hard and brilliant under pressure. Her hair, a crown of intricate, waist-length cornrows, was adorned with subtle gold cuffs that caught the soft cabin light. A bespoke Patek Philippe, a masterpiece of understated engineering, encircled her wrist. To the untrained eye, she was the picture of calm, a sculpture of success. But beneath the surface, a furnace was always burning. Across the aisle, the first act of the evening's theater began. A flight attendant presented a silver-domed tray to a smarmy tech bro in a gray suit, a man named Marcus. With a flourish, she unveiled a masterpiece, pan-seared duck breast with a cherry reduction, resting on a bed of wild rice pilaf. The aroma wafted across the aisle, a fragrant assault of privilege. Marcus chuckled, a wet, unpleasant sound, and raised his glass of Bordeaux in a silent toast to his own good fortune before smirking directly at Aris. Aris waited. Patience was a weapon she had sharpened to a razor's edge. Her company, Ethel Logistics, was one of Apex Air's largest corporate accounts, a multi-million-dollar contract that kept dozens of these flying palaces in the air. Her team was scattered throughout the plane, in business and premium economy, their laptops already glowing with the data that fueled a global empire. She had no reason to expect anything less than the flawless service she was paying for. Then, Brenda Haskins appeared. She was the lead flight attendant, a woman whose crisp navy uniform couldn't hide the frayed edges of her spirit. A severe, mousy brown bob framed a face tightened by a bitterness that had long since soured into casual cruelty. In her hand, she balanced a tray with a carelessness that was, in itself, an act of aggression. On it sat a single naked slice of plain white bread. The kind of bread you find in the back of a discount grocery store, already tasting of its plastic bag. Next to it, a glass of water, sweating and lukewarm, with not so much as a rumor of ice. Nothing else. Brenda stopped at Aris's seat. She didn't make eye contact. With a mechanical, dismissive gesture, she placed the tray on the polished table. The sound was a dull, final thud. No smile, no introduction, no explanation. Aris blinked once, her gaze dropping to the pathetic offering. The pale slice of bread seemed to mock her from the center of the pristine linen napkin. She looked back up, her eyes locking onto Brenda's. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice was perfectly even, a low, resonant tone that cut through the cabin's hum. "I believe there's been a mistake. This isn't my meal." A tiny, cruel smile played on Brenda's lips. It didn't reach her eyes, which were as cold and flat as river stones. "That's what's available for you tonight." The insult, delivered with the precision of a stiletto, took less than 10 seconds to land. It was breathtaking in its audacity. Behind Eris, a few passengers shifted, their curiosity piqued. Marcus, the tech bro across the aisle, let out a poorly stifled laugh. Further back, another man, a younger guy named Chad, angled his phone up, pretending to check his email. But the tiny lens at the top corner of the screen glowed with the faint red light of a device that was very much recording. The discrimination wasn't subtle. It was the main event. Bread and water for the black woman in 2B. Bread and water in a space where her very presence was a statistical anomaly. Eris glanced to her right. Marcus was now theatrically slicing into his duck breast, the juices running rich and dark across the porcelain. He caught her eye, that infuriating smirk spreading across his face, and raised his wine glass in a mocking salute. Brenda leaned in, her voice a venomous whisper of feigned sympathy. "If it's not to your liking," she added, her tone dripping with condescension, "you can always wait until we have spares." She lingered on the word spares, letting it hang in the air like a verdict. "You are not one of us. You are an afterthought." She had no idea. She had no earthly idea that the woman she had just dismissed as unworthy of a hot meal held contracts that could shatter her airline into 1,000,000 pieces. Eris took a slow, deliberate breath, the kind she used in boardrooms before eviscerating an opponent's argument. The heat churning in her gut was volcanic, but on the surface there was only ice. Her long, elegant fingers brushed the rim of the sweating water glass. She lifted it, took a single, small sip, and set it back down without a word. But her eyes said everything. They were ancient and knowing, and in their depths, Brenda saw a flicker of something she couldn't name. For a fraction of a second, her smugness faltered. Then pride, that ugly, stubborn mule, kicked in. She straightened her shoulders, the smirk returning, and turned away to continue her rounds. 2 rows back, Chad's friend whispered, far too loudly. "What's with the bread? Did she not pay for a real ticket?" Chad shrugged, his eyes glued to his phone screen. "Guess she doesn't look the part." Eris heard. She always heard. The whispers followed her everywhere. In the country club her membership fees helped build. In the luxury boutiques where clerks watched her hands. In the boardrooms where her strategic genius was second-guessed until a white man repeated it. Every whisper was a tiny cut, a death by 1,000 paper cuts. Tonight Brenda had just traded the paper for a shard of glass. Chad, the man in 4D, leaned forward, a glint of amusement in his eyes. His phone, still recording, had captured the whole sordid exchange. The bread, the smirk, the crushing silence. He wasn't filming for justice. He was filming for clicks. He thought he was capturing a moment of minor, in-flight drama. He had no clue he was about to upload the opening scene of a corporate earthquake. This single decision, this slice of bread, would cost Apex Air more than Brenda could ever possibly imagine. Eris leaned back against her seat. Calm, collected, calculating. With a slow, deliberate movement, she picked up the slice of bread. She didn't eat it. She tore it neatly in half, placed the 2 pieces back on the tray, and folded her hands in her lap. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't demand to see the captain. She let the raw, naked humiliation hang in the air, gathering weight and density like a thunderhead. Because storms do their most devastating work in the silence, right before the lightning strikes. Across the aisle, Marcus savored another bite of duck, his chewing noises an exaggerated performance of pleasure. His soft laughter mingled with the engine's drone. Brenda continued down the aisle, her posture radiating a smug satisfaction. The other flight attendants, witnessing the entire exchange, suddenly found the floor intensely interesting. Not one made eye contact with Eris. Not one offered to intervene. Their silence was complicity, a quiet vote in favor of the cruelty. Have you ever been in a place you paid to be, only to feel the entire room silently agree that you don't belong there? That was seat 2B tonight, a prison of leather and linen at 37,000 feet. Eris's gaze drifted to her faint reflection in the triple-paned window, a woman in a power suit, a glass and a slice of bread on her tray. To others, a passenger. To herself, a ghost of battles past. The memories rose, unbidden and sharp. The tech conference 15 years ago, when a venture capitalist handed her his coat, assuming she was an attendant, not the keynote speaker. The five-star hotel in Zurich, where the concierge tried to direct her to the service entrance. The boardroom where her revolutionary patent proposal was dismissed as ambitious, until a male colleague rephrased it and was hailed as a visionary. Each memory was a scar. Tonight, Brenda had just pressed her thumb into every single one of them. Eris's jaw tightened, a barely perceptible ripple of muscle. Outwardly, she was a statue. Inwardly, she was a supernova. The phone in 4D vibrated. Chad glanced down. A green progress bar on his screen read, "Uploading, 50%, 80%, upload complete." He added a simple incendiary caption. "First class on Apex Air, if you're the right color." He smirked, tucked the phone away, and leaned back, satisfied. The clip was already loose, a digital virus bouncing between cell towers, climbing onto servers, and preparing to infect the feeds of millions of unsuspecting eyes. She had no idea the ripple effect was already in motion. Eris's own phone rested on the armrest, its black screen a silent mirror. She didn't touch it. Not yet. The overture was still playing. The timing had to be perfect. Another attendant approached Marcus, refilling his wine with a level of ceremony usually reserved for coronations. No one came near Eris's table. The bread remained untouched. The water grew warmer. But the silence surrounding her was not weakness. It was a blade being sharpened on a whetstone of pure, unadulterated rage. Eris lifted her chin, her eyes tracking Brenda as she moved through the cabin. For a brief, charged moment, Brenda looked back, and their gazes locked across the aisle. Eris's stare was unflinching. It was cold steel wrapped in velvet. It held the weight of fortunes made and empires built. It was a look that said, "You have made a grave miscalculation." Brenda looked away first. The hum of the aircraft was unchanged, but the atmosphere in first class had curdled. Passengers whispered behind cupped hands. Phones hovered just above the armrests. Some smirked, some frowned, but every single person was aware of the gross imbalance on display. Eris sat unmoving, a statue of defiance, each passing second adding another layer of pressure to the moment. A calm presence in a storm she had not started, but one she was absolutely, terrifyingly prepared to finish. And as the two pathetic halves of bread sat untouched on her tray, the world thousands of feet below had already begun to burn. The bread remained. A pale, silent accusation. The water in the glass was now tepid, condensation sliding down its side in slow, greasy trails. Around her, the cabin feigned normalcy. The clink of cutlery against porcelain, the murmur of hushed conversations, the squeak of the drink cart's wheels. But the silence enveloping seat 2B was no longer just quiet. It was a vacuum, charged and heavy, pulling in the attention of everyone in the cabin. It was a silence that was watching, recording, and waiting for a reckoning. Back in 4D, Chad, the amateur documentarian, could barely contain his glee. The upload had been a spectacular success. 15 seconds of raw footage. Brenda's sneer, the bread and water, and the unshakable calm of the woman who refused to be broken. The video's title was a masterpiece of clickbait, first class only if you look the part. The TikTok algorithm, that voracious, amoral beast, had seized it instantly. It slotted the clip between a viral dance challenge and a makeup tutorial, feeding its raw injustice to an audience hungry for outrage. 300,000 views before the drink cart even reached the emergency exit row. Eris closed her eyes, her posture still immaculate. She wasn't sleeping. She was listening. The whispers eddied around her like toxic smoke. She probably used points to upgrade. No way she paid for that seat. It's just bread and water. Why is she making it a thing? Honestly, it's humiliating. I feel bad for her. Every syllable was a grain of sand, adding to the weight of the silence she carried. She had no idea her quiet defiance had already become a rallying cry online. Across the aisle, Marcus, the tech bro, was putting on a show, carving his duck with the theatrical flair of a dinner theater actor. He swirled the Bordeaux in his glass, taking ostentatious sniffs before each sip, as if the very act of enjoying his meal was another calculated layer of insult. Behind Eris, a different passenger muttered, just loud enough to be heard. "She'll probably sue when we land. People like that are always looking for a handout." His companion chuckled in agreement. Eris's eyelids lifted slowly. She turned her head just slightly, her gaze sweeping across the cabin. It was a calm, controlled movement, but it carried the force of a physical blow. One of the junior flight attendants, caught in her line of sight, flinched and immediately averted her eyes. Brenda returned to collect the trays, her movements brisk and defensive. She stopped at Eris's seat, snatched the tray with the untouched bread, and muttered just under her breath but loud enough for Eris to hear, "Wasteful." She didn't look at Eris as she said it. She didn't need to. The contempt was a physical thing. Eris's jaw tightened. She exhaled slowly, her fingers briefly caressing the cool metal of her watch. Then she placed both hands on her lap, perfectly still once more. What was about to happen would shock every single person on this flight, because the woman they thought they'd humiliated was about to upend far more than their dinner service. On the ground, the digital firestorm had leaped from TikTok to every other platform. A civil rights activist in Atlanta reposted it to Twitter with 5 powerful words: "Flying while black is still this." Retweets exploded, a cascade of shared outrage. A Facebook group for corporate travel agents shared it, captioned, "Imagine your client paying $12,000 for this treatment." By the time the sun rose over the skyscrapers of New York, the clip had blasted past 1 million views. Instagram influencers were stitching it, adding their own stories of being dismissed, ignored, and insulted in luxury spaces. The comments section was a torrent of fury and validation. This is exactly why diversity and inclusion training is so damn important. Unbelievable. I've been a loyal Apex customer for a decade. Never again. Bread and water in first class? This is 2025, not 1955. What the hell is wrong with people? Eris, cocooned in the aircraft's bubble, knew none of this. Not yet. But the wave was building, gathering monstrous height and power. Chad, the man in 4D, grinned as he scrolled through the notifications pouring into his phone, completely oblivious to the fact that he had just lit the fuse on a corporate bomb. He leaned forward to his friend, whispering again, "She's not saying anything. She's just going to let it go." They thought her silence was weakness. Have you ever been in a place where your very presence was put to a vote, and you lost? That was seat 2B. In Los Angeles, a lifestyle blogger with 3 million followers woke up, saw the clip, and immediately went live. "I know this look," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "This is the look of 1,000 tiny cuts. This is dignity being denied at 37,000 feet." Within an hour, her live stream had 100,000 viewers. On X, a retired Olympic gold medalist added his voice. "This isn't about the food, it's about being told without a single word that you are less than." The comments poured in. "Exactly. Been there. Felt this in my bones." The cabin of Flight 788 remained insulated in its artificial calm. Brenda moved with a brittle efficiency, her smile plastered on, but she could feel it now. The eyes, the phones angled in her direction, a creeping sense of being watched, a judgment she couldn't understand, was pressing in on her. Aris opened her eyes again. She calmly adjusted the cuff of her silk blouse, the Patek Philippe flashing under the cabin light. Then she reached for her phone. Her thumb tapped the black screen. It bloomed to life for a single second, displaying a secure, encrypted messaging app, before going dark again. To anyone watching, it was a meaningless gesture. To Aris, it was a signal. The first move on a global chessboard. In that single second, a new video surfaced online. Another passenger, sitting a few rows back, had captured Aris's response to her companion's earlier whisper. He had asked, "Isn't that humiliating?" Aris's reply, almost too quiet to hear, was 2 words. "It's noted." That clip, titled "The Calm Before the Storm," was clipped, replayed, and auto-tuned. It racked up 500,000 views before the plane even crossed the coast of Ireland. Commenters called it ice cold, chilling, the most powerful 2 words I've ever heard. The cost of this moment for Aris wasn't hunger. It was the familiar, bitter taste of having to defend her own existence, a battle she had been fighting her entire life. And now, her defense was trending. By mid-morning in the U.S., celebrities were weighing in. A Grammy-winning rapper retweeted it. "They picked the wrong one. I can feel it." An Oscar-winning director added, "Her stillness is the loudest scream I've ever heard." Screens lit up in offices, homes, and coffee shops. Hashtags surged. "Otter apex air shame. Otter bread and water. Out flying while black. Wines. So toran. It's noted." Brenda Haskins, still trapped in her tin can in the sky, still believed she was in control of her cabin. She collected plates, refilled glasses, and smiled her plastic smile. But every sideways glance confirmed it. Another phone lens, another passenger whispering. She could feel the temperature dropping, even if she didn't know why. She had no idea the world outside was already acting as her judge, jury, and executioner. The clip was no longer a piece of passenger footage. It had escaped. It had become a symbol, carrying its weight of injustice into millions of feeds. This is Black Stories Unveiled, the channel where we drag the hidden moments of dignity and power into the harsh, unforgiving light. And what you're hearing isn't a story about a slice of bread or a glass of water. It's about recognition, respect, and the catastrophic cost when they are denied. If you feel that in your soul, hit that like button right now. Back in the cabin, Aris remained a portrait of composure, her eyes fixed forward. To her right, Marcus dabbed his lips with a linen napkin, his smug grin firmly back in place. Brenda passed him another glass of wine with a deferential smile, as if they were co-conspirators sharing a secret victory. Aris watched them, her expression unreadable. Then she returned her gaze to the dark, silent screen of her phone. The aircraft sliced through the clouds, a silver dart in the endless blue. But the real turbulence was brewing thousands of miles below. Tweets were becoming news articles. Facebook posts were becoming cable news segments. A morning show anchor in New York introduced the clip, her voice heavy with practiced gravitas. "This isn't just a case of bad customer service," she declared. "This is a question of who gets to belong in the spaces we label as premium." The view counts ticked over. Hundreds of thousands became millions, then tens of millions. Iris sat in her bubble of silence. The scent of roasted duck still clung to the air. The bread was gone, but the humiliation lingered, a toxic vapor. For the crew of Flight 788, the countdown to detonation had already begun. The aircraft had been airborne for 5 hours, somewhere over the dark, churning waters of the North Atlantic, when the fragile calm finally shattered. Iris had sat in silence long enough. The bread was gone, the water glass empty, but the quiet fury she had been nursing had grown into a storm far louder than any shouted protest. Phones throughout the cabin were now buzzing incessantly with notifications as passengers saw their own flight, their own cabin, mirrored back at them on their tiny glowing screens. The clip had not only escaped, it was now banging on the door, demanding to be let back in. Brenda moved up the aisle, her chin held high, her voice crisp as she offered a hot towel to another passenger. Her eyes flickered toward Eris, a flash of irritation, before quickly looking away. She thought the insult was over. She thought the woman's silence was surrender. But Eris's silence had never been surrender. It was the first move in a war Brenda didn't even know she was fighting. With a slow, deliberate grace, Iris straightened in her seat. She reached forward and pressed the call button. The soft electronic chime echoed through the tense cabin, impossibly loud. Heads snapped around. Phones were raised. Brenda stopped mid-step, her back rigid. She turned, her movements sharp and annoyed, and marched back to seat 2B. "Yes?" she asked, her tone clipped, impatient. Iris looked up at her, her gaze steady and unblinking. "I'd like to understand the catering discrepancy," she said softly. Her voice wasn't raised, but it carried a weight that made the air feel thick. "The passenger in seat 2C received the duck breast and a Bordeaux. I received bread and water. Could you please explain the reason for that?" The words, so simple and direct, were a surgical strike. They offered no room for evasion. Brenda's lips twitched. "A catering miscalculation," she said briskly, the lie thin and brittle. "It happens." Iris tilted her head, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if studying a particularly puzzling insect. "And your professional decision, faced with this miscalculation," she asked, her voice still unnervingly calm, "was to deliver bread and water without a single word of explanation or apology?" The lead attendant hesitated. For the first time, a flicker of genuine unease appeared in her eyes before she quickly smothered it. She hardened her expression. "You received what was available," she replied, her voice taut. The ripple effect was about to become a tidal wave, and she was standing right at the shore. 2 rows back, another phone camera was now openly recording. This was no longer about documenting a quiet injustice. This was a confrontation, and everyone was a spectator. Iris folded her hands on her table. "You know," she said, her voice dropping into an almost conversational tone, "I've had bread and water before. It's a key part of a spiritual fast I undertake twice a year, but that's when I choose it, not when I've paid $12,000 for a first-class ticket." The line sliced through the cabin's tension like a guillotine. A few passengers audibly gasped. Someone whispered, "Oh, damn," but didn't dare say more. Brenda stiffened, her face flushing a blotchy red. "If you have a complaint, you can file it with customer service after we land," she snapped, her words a clumsy, defensive shield. Iris's gaze never left her face. It wasn't angry, it wasn't pleading. It was a look that stripped away titles, uniforms, and excuses, leaving only the raw, ugly truth of the moment. She has absolutely no idea who she is talking to. The tech bro across the aisle, Marcus, chose that moment to interject, chuckling loudly. "Some people are just never satisfied," he muttered, loud enough for half the cabin to hear. "Should be grateful she's up here at all." Eris slowly turned her head and fixed her eyes on him. She said nothing. She just held his gaze. It was the kind of look that, in a boardroom, preceded a hostile takeover. The kind of look that ended careers. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his smug laughter dying in his throat. Brenda cleared her throat, trying desperately to regain control. I'll see if there is anything else that can be arranged," she said, the words stumbling out. Aris gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. "You do that." Brenda turned and fled toward the galley, her brisk walk now a hasty retreat. The damage was done. The cabin had seen it. The phones had recorded it. And on the ground, the confrontation was hitting the internet like a second shockwave. The original clip had been shocking. This was Seismic, a powerful woman calmly dismantling a flight attendant's flimsy excuses, sentence by devastating sentence. It's noted, vaulted to the #1 trending topic worldwide. Within the hour, tens of millions had watched her deliver the line about fasting. That quote alone became a banner for righteous indignation, plastered across Twitter, Instagram, and Reddit. Dignity, in her hands, had become a weapon sharper and more effective than any angry outburst. Minutes later, Brenda returned, her face a pale, tight mask. She carried a tray. On it was the pan-seared duck, the wild rice, and a carefully poured glass of Bordeaux. She set it down wordlessly in front of Aris. Aris didn't touch it. She didn't even look at the food. She looked only at Brenda. Her voice, when she spoke, was almost kind, which made the words infinitely more brutal. "Do you believe this fixes it?" Brenda's jaw clenched. "It's the proper meal," she managed to reply. Eris's eyes lingered on her. "Proper meal?" she repeated softly, the phrase now tasting like poison. Then she leaned back, folding her arms across her chest. "Keep it." The cabin fell utterly, completely silent. A refusal, not of food, but of a tainted peace offering. A refusal to allow the insult to be so easily erased. Chad, in 4D, nearly dropped his phone, fumbling to capture the moment. A passenger rejecting the correction, refusing to be appeased by scraps delivered late and without remorse. The new video spread before Brenda had even turned away. By the time Flight 788 reached European airspace, news anchors in New York were broadcasting it live. The calm black woman in seat 2B, declining the very meal she was entitled to because the insult had already been served. News tickers ran with it. Passenger rejects Apex Air's attempted apology in mid-air showdown. Inside the cabin, Brenda stood frozen for a second too long. Her authority, her composure, everything unraveling in that deafening silence. Then she turned sharply, her heels clicking a frantic rhythm on the floor as she vanished once more toward the galley. Aris remained still, her eyes on the untouched tray of duck. She lifted her phone again. The screen glowed. Her thumb pressed the screen once, sending a single, pre-written message before the display went dark. It wasn't a message for the passengers or the crew. It was a message to a network of people thousands of miles away, people who could move mountains with a single command. The message contained only 2 words: "Begin protocol." One executive's phone buzzed on a nightstand in a New York penthouse. Another chimed on a desk in a London skyscraper. Both read the same 2 words. Aris lowered her phone, placed it carefully on the armrest, and closed her eyes once more. To anyone else, she looked as if she were merely resting. But her silence was no longer a shield. It was a countdown clock. The ripple had become a wave, and Brenda Haskins, who thought she had humbled a passenger with a piece of bread, had just unwittingly lit the signal fire for the downfall of her entire company. Encrypted messages were now flying. Screens were lighting up in boardrooms an ocean away. CEOs were being startled awake. Multi-billion-dollar deals were beginning to tremble. And in seat 2B, the woman they thought they had reduced to bread and water was preparing to show the world exactly who the hell she was. The question was no longer if she would reveal her power. It was when. As Flight 788 crossed into European airspace, the cabin lights dimmed, casting long shadows that seemed to deepen the tension. Eris's eyes remained closed, her phone resting like a dormant weapon at her side. To the humbled crew, she appeared subdued, perhaps even defeated. To the outside world, she was the calm eye of a global hurricane. In New York, the corporate headquarters of Apex Air, a glass and steel monument to hubris, was ablaze with fluorescent light long after midnight. In the 40th floor boardroom, a wall of screens broadcast the disaster in real time. Hashtags surged across every platform. Schorn's Apex Air shame, Masked flying while black, Masked breadline in first class. The trending graphs weren't just climbing, they were vertical. "What do you mean 50 million views?" barked Richard Sterling, the CEO of Apex Air, a man whose silver hair and tailored suit couldn't hide the panic in his eyes. He slammed a beefy palm on the mahogany conference table, rattling a pitcher of ice water. The head of public relations, a woman half his age, adjusted her glasses nervously. "Sir, it passed 50 million an hour ago. TikTok, Instagram, X. It's metastasizing." "Fix it," Sterling roared, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "We're trying, sir, but—" She hesitated, her finger tracing a line on her tablet. "Reddit threads are connecting this to older complaints about this specific crew member, Brenda Haskins. There are now multiple claims that this isn't the first time." The chief operating officer, a hawk-faced man named Peterson, cut in sharply. "That makes it a pattern. One viral clip, we spin it as a regrettable, isolated incident. A pattern of behavior? That's lethal. That's a class action lawsuit." A heavy silence descended on the room. This decision would cost them more than just angry passengers. It would cost them the trust of the corporate partners who held their very future in their hands. Meanwhile, in London, the first rays of morning light were creeping across the gleaming towers of the financial district. In the offices of Vanguard Innovations, the board of directors was convened in an emergency session. Untouched cups of coffee grew cold on the polished table. On the main screen, paused mid-frame, was the image of Eris Thorne, a tray of bread and water before her. "We cannot afford to be associated with this," said Eleanor Vance, Vanguard's formidable CEO. Her voice was as calm and sharp as surgical steel. "If that woman is who the internet thinks she is—" "She is," the CFO interrupted, pushing his tablet to the center of the table. "I've had my team triple-check it. That is Dr. Eris Thorne, CEO of Ethel Logistics. She is our sole candidate for the European distribution contract for Project Chimera." The room went cold. Every director understood the stakes. Ethel Logistics wasn't just another vendor. They were the logistical backbone for Vanguard's upcoming product launch, a revolutionary piece of medical technology worth billions, a project that required flawless, precision-timed global distribution. Eleanor's fingers drummed a quiet, menacing rhythm on the table. "And she was publicly, virally humiliated on our preferred partner airline?" A younger executive whispered the terrifying conclusion. "If she withdraws from the partnership, Project Chimera collapses." "And so does the $100 million freight deal we just signed with Apex Air," Eleanor finished coldly. The weight of her words settled like a tombstone. The airline's survival was no longer a question of public opinion. It hinged on the trust of a single, deeply insulted corporate partner. At Black Stories Unveiled, we constantly remind our viewers that these stories are never about a single moment. They are mirrors reflecting the deep, often rotten systems beneath the surface. A tray of bread, a glass of water, these are not mistakes. They are symbols. And when those symbols collide with immense power, the consequences ripple far beyond a single airplane cabin. In a Manhattan newsroom, an anchor was rehearsing her lines for the morning broadcast. Reading from a teleprompter, she said, "Coming up after the break, outrage at 37,000 feet. The first-class passenger served bread and water and the billion-dollar secret she was hiding." The clip played silently on the monitor behind her, Aris's calm expression frozen in time. On Instagram, influencers were now creating reaction videos, their faces a mask of theatrical shock. Memes were spreading across Reddit like a virus, a loaf of bread photoshopped onto an Apex Air advertisement with the tagline, "First Class Dining." Celebrities continued to pour fuel on the fire. A Grammy-winning singer tweeted, "Bread and water in 2025. Yeah, we see you." It's noted. Politicians were starting to notice. A U.S. senator posted from her official account. Systemic bias isn't about intent, it's about impact. The impact here is undeniable and unacceptable. By dawn, the airline's stock price was bleeding out. Pre-market trading showed a catastrophic 7% drop, billions in market value vanishing before the opening bell even rang. The ripple effect was no longer a ripple. It was a tsunami, and it was pulling entire corporations under its waves. Meanwhile, back in the cabin, Brenda and her crew were trying to maintain a facade of professionalism. They avoided seat 2B like it was radioactive, serving other passengers with frantic, brittle smiles. But the whispers followed them down the aisle. Passengers were leaning into their phones, comparing the viral videos to the very faces of the crew in front of them. "That's her," one passenger muttered to another. "That's the flight attendant from the video." Aris remained still, eyes half-lidded, watching everything without seeming to watch at all. Her phone buzzed once more against the armrest. She glanced at the screen, the faint glow reflecting in her eyes. The message was from Eleanor Vance at Vanguard. It was brief. Board requesting confirmation. "Is it true you're on Apex Flight 788? Aris exhaled through her nose, a slow, deliberate breath. To the oblivious passengers around her, she was just a woman checking a message. To Aris, it was confirmation. Her silent protest had breached the walls of the most powerful boardrooms in the world. The personal cost of this moment was no longer just her dignity. It was the stability of billion-dollar contracts, the fate of an airline hanging on her next move. Back at Apex headquarters, CEO Richard Sterling buried his face in his hands. "Find her," he growled into the table. "Get her on the phone. Offer her anything. Lifetime free flights. $1 million. Just find her and fix this." The head of PR swallowed hard. "Sir, what if she doesn't want it fixed?" Sterling looked up, his face pale, his bluster gone. For the first time all night, he seemed to grasp the terrifying truth. This wasn't a disgruntled customer they could appease with vouchers and apologies. This was a force of nature they had foolishly tried to contain. On the ground, media commentators were sharpening their knives. One popular podcast host declared, "This isn't about a service failure. This is about who corporations believe deserve respect. And when the person you disrespect controls contracts that can make or break you, that's not just bias, it's corporate suicide." Reddit threads had now connected all the dots, pulling up Ethel Logistics' public filings, speculating about Eris Thorne's immense personal wealth and influence. Twitter was a firestorm of theories. She's more powerful than they know. This isn't random. This is a reckoning. In living rooms, offices, and cafes around the globe, people replayed the clip of her refusing the meal. A refusal that said, without words, some wounds cannot be bandaged with a piece of meat. And in a suite overlooking the Thames in London, Eleanor Vance, CEO of Vanguard Innovations, typed an urgent message to her entire board. Confirm if Dr. Thorne was on that flight. Immediately. Our entire launch depends on it. The plane continued its eastward journey. Aris sat composed, her tray table clear, her phone face down once more. To the crew, she looked harmless, a problem to be dealt with upon landing. To the outside world, her identity had become the single most important question in the business world, a question upon which billions of dollars now balanced. The storm had already claimed public trust. Next, it was coming for corporate alliances. And when that plane landed in Geneva, there would be nowhere for anyone to hide. The world was about to learn exactly who the woman in seat 2B really was. The soft thud of the landing gear kissing the runway at Geneva was a sound of finality. For the passengers, the long, tense transatlantic crossing was over. But for the woman in seat 2B, the landing wasn't an ending. It was the ignition sequence. As the aircraft taxied toward the gate, a symphony of electronic chimes erupted through the cabin. Phones, dormant for hours, reconnected to the global network, and a flood of notifications poured in. The bread and water clip, the confrontation, the refusal. Tens of millions of views. Global news coverage. Passengers scrolled, their eyes wide, darting between the glowing screens in their hands and the quiet, composed woman sitting just a few rows ahead. "Holy shit, she's everywhere," someone whispered. "Look, CNN, BBC, that's her. That's the woman in 2B. Brenda Haskins stood near the galley, her uniform suddenly feeling like a straitjacket. She risked a glance toward Eris, then quickly looked away, her face ashen. Every move she made, every breath she took, now felt like it was being judged by an unseen global audience. Recorded, uploaded, condemned. Aris remained perfectly still, hands folded in her lap as the plane docked. Her phone buzzed one last time. She glanced down. A message from her chief of staff. It was concise. Vanguard confirmed. Media requests overwhelming. Statement prepared. Security is on site. She exhaled slowly, centering herself. The time for silence was over. The time for thunder had arrived. The cabin door opened with a metallic hiss. Passengers, eager to escape the charged atmosphere, surged into the aisle. But the jet bridge was not an exit. It was an arena. A blinding supernova of camera flashes erupted. Reporters, held back by a thin line of airport security, shouted questions over one another, their voices a chaotic roar. "Dr. Thorne, is it true you were denied a proper meal on a first-class flight? Dr. Thorne, will Ethel Logistics be pulling its contracts with Apex Air? What do you have to say to the airline?" The reveal was complete. Eris Thorne stepped into the blinding light. No hesitation. No rush. Her mere presence seemed to command the chaos, quieting the frenzy for a single, charged beat. She was no longer anonymous, no longer just the woman in seat 2B. She was Dr. Eris Thorne, founder and CEO of Ethel Logistics, the Fortune 500 powerhouse whose invisible network of ships, planes, and trucks formed the circulatory system of global commerce. A titan who controlled billion-dollar supply chains across 6 continents. She has no idea. The thought echoed with brutal irony. Brenda, the crew, the smug tech bro, the airline itself. None of them had any idea they had picked a fight with the very partner holding their corporate future in the palm of her hand. Aris raised a hand gently, palm outward. It wasn't a gesture of surrender. It was a command for silence. And silence is what she got. microphones stretched toward her like desperate metallic flowers. "Last night," she began, her voice low but amplified by a dozen mics, carrying with an authority that was absolute. "I was served bread and water in a cabin for which my company pays a premium for dignity and care. That moment was not about hunger. It was about an assumption about who belongs in spaces of power and who does not." Her gaze swept across the cameras, unwavering, holding the attention of the entire world. "Ethel Logistics holds contracts with airlines across the globe, including this one. As of this morning, all of those contracts are under immediate and total review." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Reporters began shouting all at once. Eris continued calmly, each syllable weighted with consequence. "This decision will cost more than one meal. It will cost millions in lost revenue and potentially billions in lost trust. Because prejudice," she paused, letting the final words land with the force of a battering ram, "is not a service failure. It is a fundamental business failure." The words detonated across newsrooms worldwide. Live clips were replayed instantly on CNN, NBC, the BBC, and Al Jazeera. By midday, headlines screamed from every major news outlet. Fortune 500 CEO humiliated in first class, airline faces collapse. On Wall Street, the trading floor turned into a bloodbath. Apex Air's stock didn't just drop, it plummeted, plunging a catastrophic 12% by noon and erasing nearly $4 billion of market value in a matter of hours. Analysts on financial networks weren't calling it a dip. They were calling it a corporate earthquake. The ripple effect was no longer just reshaping public opinion. It was about to reshape an entire industry. Back at Apex headquarters, CEO Richard Sterling's face turned the color of ash as Eris's statement played live on every monitor in the boardroom. "Contracts under review," he repeated, the words hollow and numb. "She controls our 3 largest international freight deals. If we lose her, Vanguard pulls out of their agreement and we collapse," the CFO finished, his voice grim. The boardroom erupted into pure panic. Executives shouted desperate, useless solutions. "Draft an apology. Fire the crew. Send her a check." But none of it mattered. The decision was no longer theirs to make. It belonged to the woman they had dismissed with a slice of bread. Meanwhile, on Twitter, Eris's final sentence became the #1 trending topic globally. Memes transformed her statement into a rallying cry. Screenshots of her composed, resolute face circulated with the caption, "Prejudice isn't a service failure, it's a business failure." Civil rights advocates praised her strategic brilliance. Investors warned of dire consequences for any company that didn't take heed. Ordinary travelers flooded social media feeds with their own stories of dismissal and disrespect, now armed with a powerful new vocabulary. One viral post read, "She didn't yell. She didn't threaten. She just reminded them that when you disrespect power, power responds." At Vanguard Innovations headquarters, a wave of relief washed through the boardroom. Their CEO, Eleanor Vance, spoke softly. "She hasn't pulled out of our partnership directly. She's signaling leverage. That means we still have her." But the wiser members of the board knew better. Her signal wasn't just about leverage. It was a warning shot across the bow of an entire industry. Apex Air had crossed a line, and survival for any of them now depended on immediate, systemic change. Not just a quick apology. Brenda Haskins stood in a sterile crew corridor at the Geneva airport, her face pale, her hands trembling as her supervisor barked into a phone. Reporters were already naming her. The footage of her sneer, her dismissive tone, her words replayed endlessly on a nearby monitor. Her world was collapsing in real time. In Eris Thorne's world, it was expanding. Because power, once revealed, does not shrink back into the shadows. By evening, her image filled screens across the globe. Her words echoed in boardrooms, classrooms, and living rooms. She hadn't just confronted a single flight attendant. She had forced an entire industry to stare at its own ugly reflection in the mirror. For her, this was never about revenge. It was about principle. It was about ensuring that no passenger, not her, not anyone, would ever again be told they didn't belong in a seat they had earned. And though Apex Air was scrambling to contain the fire, the truth was blindingly clear. The damage was done. The consequences were irreversible. The woman they tried to reduce to bread and water had just revealed herself to be something far greater. The architect of their undoing. Iris returned to her hotel that night, slipping past the throngs of cameras with her private security team. In the quiet of her penthouse suite, she poured a glass of still water and stood by the panoramic window, watching the lights of Geneva shimmer below. Her phone buzzed relentlessly with messages of congratulations, support, outrage, and analysis. She set it aside. For her, the work was never about the noise. It was about impact. She had revealed her power. The consequences were only just beginning to unfold. Wait until you see her final move. The footage of Eris's calm, devastating statement didn't just echo. It resonated, creating seismic waves that shook the foundations of the entire airline industry. By the time dusk settled over Geneva, her words had been translated into a dozen languages and plastered across breaking news banners from São Paulo to Seoul. Apex Air's clumsy attempts at crisis management had utterly collapsed. Their generic statements of apology were drowned under a tidal wave of headlines declaring, Fortune 500. CEO humiliated, a reckoning in the skies. Their stock value continued to freefall into an abyss. But the damage was no longer contained to one failing company. Industry analysts crowded onto cable news panels, their faces tight with a shared sense of urgency. This isn't an isolated incident, one declared on a prime-time broadcast. This is a symptom of a deep-seated cultural rot. If it happened on Apex Air, passengers will now assume it can happen anywhere. Competitors scrambled to get ahead of the fallout. Press releases flooded the internet, each promising zero-tolerance policies, enhanced cultural sensitivity training, and renewed commitments to diversity. Some airlines offered free upgrades to minority business owners, a desperate, transparent gesture to erase the shadow of what had unfolded at 37,000 feet. But gestures were no longer enough. This was no longer about a meal. It was about trust, and the world was freshly aware of who had, and had not, deserved it. In Washington, D.C., regulators convened an emergency hearing with unprecedented speed. Officials from the Department of Transportation and the FAA reviewed the footage frame by frame, their expressions hardening with each replay. A commissioner, a formidable woman known for her sharp tongue, spoke bluntly to the assembled airline executives. If a customer can pay top dollar for a premium product and still be treated as less than human, then we have a systemic problem. Full stop. Another added, and when that customer happens to be a CEO controlling billions in global logistics, we see what happens when systemic prejudice collides with systemic power. This industry cannot survive this kind of exposure without radical, immediate reform. The ripple effect had just breached the halls of government. Class action law firms smelled blood in the water. Within 24 hours, 3 major firms announced investigations into discriminatory patterns across all major U.S. carriers. Traveler hotlines were inundated with thousands of calls as people shared their own stories. Bread and water became a viral metaphor, a shorthand for every quiet indignity, every dismissive glance, every assumption suffered in silence. The lawsuits began to pile up, each one sharpening the knife being pressed to the industry's throat. At the Apex Air headquarters, The remaining executives gathered again. The mood had shifted from panic to grim resignation. The shouting was gone, replaced by the funereal quiet of men staring at numbers on a screen that represented their own ruin. Billions in market cap, gone. Partnerships, frozen. Advance bookings, plummeting off a cliff. The CFO spoke in a near whisper. "We're on the verge of insolvency." The CEO, Richard Sterling, clenched his jaw. "Then we make cuts." "Cut what?" someone asked, their voice hollow. Sterling looked up, his eyes cold. "Not what? Who?" The announcement came the next morning. Brenda Haskins and the entire crew of Flight 788 were summarily fired. But it was a token sacrifice. And the world knew it. The bloodletting didn't stop there. The COO resigned under immense pressure. The head of customer service followed. Within 48 hours, a cascade of firings and forced resignations reached the vice president tier. The message to the public was clear. We are carving out the disease. But everyone knew it was a desperate attempt to save a patient that was already dead. Across the Atlantic, in her Geneva hotel, Iris watched the headlines scroll across her screen. She didn't smile. There was no triumph in her eyes, only a cold, hard certainty. For her, this was about far more than punishing one airline. It was about reshaping an entire industry. This isn't just about punishment. It's about forcing a system to look at itself and admit its own rot. She poured another glass of water, stared at her reflection against the city lights, and whispered to herself, "They'll change, or they'll collapse." Competitors heard the warning loud and clear. Shares of rival airlines dipped as investors feared industry-wide contamination. Some carriers announced mandatory, externally audited training programs overnight. Others reshuffled their executive boards to signal a new direction. One European airline, in a stroke of PR genius, publicly offered Iris a partnership to create and chair a new initiative called Dignity in the Skies, promising unprecedented transparency and passenger-led oversight. Stockholders applauded. Travelers reposted their pledge with cautious optimism. It was proof that systemic change was no longer optional. It was a matter of survival. But change never comes without resistance. Industry lobbyists in Washington began whispering about overreaction and trial by social media. Anonymous sources in trade publications claimed the whole issue was being blown out of proportion, but their words were whispers against a hurricane. The world had seen the bread. It had seen the water. It had seen the unblinking stare of the woman in seat 2B. And no amount of spin could erase it. Civil rights groups organized protests at major airports. Signs read, "We belong in first class too, and dignity is not an upgrade." Crowds chanted Iris's words. "Prejudice isn't a service failure. It's a business failure." Airline unions scrambled to shield their members, but the public pressure was immense. Training programs were overhauled. Complaint hotlines were expanded and given real power. For the first time, accountability wasn't just a buzzword, it was a bottom line. News anchors summarized the situation starkly. One passenger's silence has become an entire industry's reckoning. Iris's image, her intricate cornrows, her unwavering gaze, graced the covers of Time and Forbes. Analysts called her the accidental reformer. Activists called her the mirror. To millions, she became a symbol of resilience, a reminder of the immense power that lies in quiet, unshakable dignity. But Iris herself knew there was nothing accidental about it. Every move, from the moment she tore the bread in half, had been deliberate. Inside Vanguard Innovation's boardroom, the executives were adjusting their long-term strategy. Their CEO, Eleanor Vance, shook her head in grudging admiration. "We were lucky," she told her board. "Dr. Thorne hasn't withdrawn from our partnership. But we have all seen what happens when she decides enough is enough. That airline won't survive without a complete structural overhaul. And neither will we if we fail to learn this lesson. The room nodded in silent, sober agreement. Deals were shifted. Policies were rewritten. The lesson was now written in the stark, unforgiving language of profit and loss. Prejudice had a price tag, and it was catastrophic. The lawsuits moved forward. One class action suit claimed damages in the hundreds of millions. Regulators demanded sweeping audits of training manuals and hiring practices. Continental Transair announced a complete corporate restructuring, but analysts were doubtful it would be enough to save them. Because when a person's dignity is stripped away at 37,000 feet, the consequences crash down to earth and shatter everything. Aris stood once more at her window, her phone, still buzzing, left on the table behind her. She knew what the headlines said. She knew which contracts were trembling. But she also knew something else. This wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a systemic shift. And she had forced it into being with nothing more than silence, principle, and the refusal to be appeased. The personal cost of this moment would ripple through her life for years to come. But she accepted it. Because real change is never free, and an entire industry had just been handed the bill. A journalist, in a piece that would win a Pulitzer, summed it up in one chilling line. This isn't the story of a meal gone wrong. It's the story of an empire forced to reckon with a prejudice it had, until now believed was invisible. The storm no longer belonged to Eris Thorne alone. It had turned, with merciless and cleansing force, toward all those who had once believed they were untouchable. In a small, nondescript apartment on the outskirts of London, Brenda Haskins sat in the dark, the blinds drawn tight against the morning sun. Her phone would not stop buzzing. A relentless torrent of messages, notifications, and calls from blocked numbers. Some from friends offering pity, some from strangers offering death threats. All demanding answers she could not give. The clips of her face played on a loop across every network. Her sneer, her dismissive words, her tray of bread and water, a ghost haunting her own life. She muted the television, but the silence was worse. In her mind, the words echoed on a loop. That's what's available for you tonight. It wasn't just her job that was gone. It was her name, her reputation, her future. Apex Air's official announcement had come at noon. Effective immediately, the crew of Flight 788 has been terminated following gross violations of our professional standards and core values. The statement was brief, cold, and final. A public execution. But justice, or what the public perceived as justice, didn't stop at termination. Passengers from other flights, emboldened by the global outcry, began stepping forward with their own stories about Brenda. Leaked emails surfaced, written in her same clipped, dismissive tone. Former colleagues, speaking anonymously, admitted she carried herself like a petty tyrant of the skies, untouchable in her navy blue uniform. The public devoured every damning revelation. This wasn't one mistake, a commentator said on a prime-time panel. It was a pattern of contempt, and it finally collided with someone powerful enough to refuse to be its victim. Brenda tried to vanish, deleting her social media and disconnecting her phone number, but the internet has no shadows deep enough to hide in. Paparazzi camped outside her building. Tabloid shows dissected her 20-year career. Memes spread faster than any apology could. Her face was photoshopped onto packages of cheap bread. Her name became a trending punchline, a shorthand for petty, racist arrogance. The humiliation was absolute and inescapable. She had no idea what it felt like to be on the other side of public judgment. Until now. The ripple of her actions stretched to her family. Her husband, a quiet accountant, was hounded by reporters. Her children were whispered about at school. Friends and neighbors crossed the street to avoid her. In her suffocating isolation, Brenda was forced to confront a devastating truth. She had become a cautionary tale, a symbol. Justice had found her, not in a courtroom or a prison cell, but in the complete and utter collapse of the life she had built. At Black Stories Unveiled, we don't tell these stories to celebrate anyone's destruction. We tell them because justice, when it finally arrives, is rarely clean or simple. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. Was Brenda's public shaming a fitting punishment, or was it a disproportionate consequence? And how many others like her exist, hidden behind uniforms and titles, believing their small power grants them immunity? These are the questions millions debated as the world's cameras turned not just on Eris, but on the system that created Brenda. On late-night television, the debate raged. One host replayed the clip of Eris refusing the makeup meal, then cut to the news of Brenda's termination. "Viewers," he asked, his face serious, "was this justice, or did it go too far?" The show's phone lines lit up as audiences weighed in. Some argued that Brenda deserved nothing less than public disgrace for her blatant racism. Others insisted that no single person should be made to bear the weight of an entire industry's sins. But no one denied the raw power of the moment. Justice had been served, and it was messy, brutal, and unforgettable. Eris watched none of it. She was already focused on the next move, the move after that, and the one after that. For her, justice wasn't a spectacle. It was structural. It was about ensuring that Brenda's fate wasn't just an isolated story, but a clear, unambiguous warning that would reshape the entire landscape of service and hospitality. Because justice for one flight meant nothing if the skies themselves remained unchanged. By the end of the week, Brenda Haskins's flight attendant license was permanently revoked. No airline would touch her application. Her career in the skies had ended with a single, contemptuous tray. The rest of the crew from Flight 788 scattered into obscurity, some silent, some bitter, but all of them branded by the same indelible stain. A talk show host summed it up in one perfect line. They thought they held authority over one passenger. Now they carry the consequences for an entire industry's arrogance. The justice was personal, undeniable, and final. But the world was still left with a lingering, unsettling question. Was this enough? The downfall of one flight crew had become a powerful lesson, but the world was not finished with this story. The storm refused to settle. It spread like wildfire, leaping across continents and into the highest corridors of power. By the second week, the headlines had shifted. They no longer spoke only of humiliation or contracts or stock crashes. They spoke of reform, of hearings, of global systemic change. In Washington, lawmakers convened with an urgency usually reserved for acts of war, pressing airline executives under oath. They replayed the footage for the 10th time, until the image of bread and water on a silver tray was burned into the memory of every person in the chamber. If a Fortune 500 CEO can be treated this way, one senator demanded, his voice thundering, what possible chance does an ordinary passenger have? There was no answer, only a profound, guilty silence that spoke volumes. In Brussels, the European Commission declared a sweeping new initiative, mandatory, independent diversity and inclusion audits for every carrier operating within the EU. It was an unprecedented move. The commissioner's voice was like steel as she declared, "Passenger dignity is a component of passenger safety, and safety is not negotiable." In Montreal, at the headquarters of the International Civil Aviation Organization, the flags of over 100 nations lined a chamber where delegates convened an emergency summit. The bread and water clip appeared on a massive screen, Eris Thorne's calm, resolute face visible to all. A delegate from a West African nation rose slowly, his voice heavy with the weight of decades. For too long, Our travelers have been treated as second-class citizens in first-class cabins. Today, the world has finally seen what we have always known." The hall erupted in somber, sustained applause, the sound echoing like a long-overdue verdict. Across Asia, governments moved with astonishing speed. In Tokyo, Seoul, and Singapore, transportation ministers launched their own investigations, each making public pronouncements. "We will not tolerate humiliation at altitude." The ripple was global. It was irreversible. But the halls of government were not the only spaces where the shockwave landed. At an Atlanta megachurch, the pastor held up his tablet mid-sermon, showing the congregation the clip of Eris's quiet refusal. "She did not need to raise her voice," he told them, his voice ringing with passion. Her dignity thundered louder than rage, and the world carried her silence into every household. The congregation rose to their feet as one, their applause shaking the rafters. In a London office, workers gathered over tea, their chatter filled with debate. "Would you forgive them if it were you?" one asked. "Never," another insisted. "If she forgives them, nothing really changes." A third voice wavered. "But if no one ever forgives, how do we move on?" At universities, students organized teach-ins, filling lecture halls to discuss structural discrimination and the high price of silence. Flyers appeared on bulletin boards. "Justice is not optional. Belonging is not negotiable." Hashtags bloomed. "Srein oi for seats for all." Dignity at 30 feet. The industry scrambled to survive. Lufthansa pledged to install independent oversight boards. Emirates announced sweeping internal audits. Delta promised mandatory de-escalation training with publicly available reports. Their stock values began to stabilize as investors rewarded their swift, decisive responses. Apex Air, paralyzed by indecision and guilt, continued to bleed red on the trading floors. The lawsuits mounted, each one more damaging than the last. Lawyers demanded hundreds of millions in damages, not for one passenger, but for a corporate culture that had persisted for decades. Judges nodded gravely, the phrase "systemic contempt" repeated like a refrain in every court filing. And yet, at the epicenter of it all, Aris lived quietly. She refused all interviews, declined invitations to panels, and ignored the cacophony of pundits dissecting her every move. She moved between her office and her hotel suites with the same calm precision she had shown in seat 2B. But behind her wall of silence, a new conflict was stirring. One evening in Paris, she stood at the window of her suite, the Eiffel Tower glittering in the distance, a glass of water in her hand. The reflection staring back at her was a mask of triumph and profound weariness. Memories rose, unbidden. At 20, being stopped by a hotel security guard who assumed she was lost and told her to use the service entrance. At 25, pitching a revolutionary logistics model, only to be ignored until a male colleague repeated her idea word for word and was met with a round of applause. Each memory was a wound, a scar she had carried in silence. And through it all, she heard her mother's voice, a constant refrain from her childhood. "Power isn't how loud you shout, Eris. Power is knowing when to be silent." Now, those words haunted her. The world wasn't just watching her victory, it was waiting for her choice. Talk shows debated it nightly. "Justice has been served," one host declared. "The question now is, will she extend grace, or will she let the entire company burn to the ground?" Panelists were split. Hashtags battled for dominance, like no mercy versus choose grace. The New York Times ran an editorial asking, "Does mercy weaken justice?" The Guardian countered with a piece titled, "Sometimes mercy is the sharpest form of justice." Every debate circled back to her. Every sentence ended with her name. Her own advisors urged her to be aggressive. "The industry is on its knees," her general counsel told her. "Press harder. Finish this. Leave them no room to retreat. Aris listened, then dismissed them with a wave of her hand. She returned to the window, staring at the shimmering lights of Paris. She thought of Brenda Haskins, disgraced, vilified, pleading for understanding in a shaky, tearful interview that had gone viral for all the wrong reasons. She thought of the rest of the crew, scattered and nameless, their careers destroyed, and she thought of herself, composed in Seat 2B, refusing not only the bread, but the easy appeasement of the duck that followed. The question clawed at her. Would showing mercy now dilute the movement she had started, or would it preserve its moral high ground? Would pursuing vengeance to the bitter end be remembered as justice or as cruelty? Could she allow space for redemption, or had the time for second chances long since expired? The debate was no longer taking place in television studios or parliaments. It was raging inside her own chest, where her mother's words pressed hard against the echo of millions of voices calling for blood. For Eris Thorne, the personal cost of this moment was no longer measured in contracts or dollars or headlines. It was measured in legacy. Whatever she chose next would define not just her, but the memory of this entire movement for generations to come. She whispered into the silent, opulent air of her suite, "The choice is mine." And with those 3 words, the entire world leaned forward, holding its breath. The press conference hall was a tinderbox of anticipation. Rows of cameras stood like a firing squad. Dozens of microphones bristled from the podium. Journalists were pressed shoulder to shoulder, their pens poised, the air electric with the unspoken question that had dominated global headlines for 2 weeks. Would she forgive, or would she deliver the final fatal blow? The answer hovered in the air, heavy, expectant, unbearable. Eris Thorne stepped onto the stage. She wore no extravagant armor, only a simple, dark, tailored suit that framed her presence with understated power. Her cornrows, adorned with their simple gold cuffs, gleamed under the impossibly white lights. A profound silence fell as she approached the podium. She placed her customary glass of water down, her fingers resting lightly against the cool stem. She looked out at the sea of faces, her gaze unblinking, her expression devoid of any hesitation. When she spoke, her voice was calm, but the words cut through the silence like a surgeon's blade. "The industry has asked me if I will forgive," she began. "Executives have asked if I will accept their apologies. Commentators have asked if I will show mercy. My answer is simple." She paused for a beat, letting the weight of the moment settle on every person in the room, on every person watching around the world. "No." A collective audible gasp filled the hall. Pens scribbled furiously. Some reporters froze, stunned into inaction. Aris continued, her tone unchanged, yet each syllable seemed to ring with greater force than the last. "Mercy belongs where mistakes are made in ignorance. Mercy is for those who show genuine remorse and begin the hard work of change at the root. But on Flight 788, what I and what the world witnessed was not ignorance. It was contempt. It was an arrogance sharpened by years of repetition. It was the symptom of a corporate culture that had been warned, reported, documented, and had chosen, repeatedly, to ignore it. "I will not," she said, her voice dropping, yet gaining a terrifying intensity. "Forgive contempt." The words detonated. Across the room, across news feeds, across the globe, social media exploded. No Mercy surged, climbing past 1 million posts in less than an hour. Screens on every continent replayed her voice, her words becoming an instant anthem. "I will not forgive contempt." At the Apex Air headquarters, the few remaining executives collapsed into their seats as the broadcast played. Some buried their heads in their hands. The market reacted in real time. Their stock, which had stabilized, plunged another 12%, entering a death spiral from which it would not recover. Major partners, who had been waiting for this moment, immediately froze all remaining deals. Vanguard Innovations Board released a statement confirming what they had already decided. Their $100 million freight contract was officially withdrawn, effective immediately. The airline was left utterly exposed, its remaining contracts evaporating like sand through its fingers. For Eris, this was not vengeance. It was consequence. It was the inevitable outcome of a long and arrogant gamble. She had warned them with her silence. She had warned them with her refusal of their tainted meal. She had warned them with her calm, damning statement at the airport. Now she was drawing a line in the sand, a line so deep and clear it could never be blurred or crossed again. But the aftermath stretched beyond the boardroom. In churches, congregations debated whether her refusal to forgive was a sign of righteous justice or human hardness. In office lunchrooms, workers argued passionately over whether she had gone too far, whether she should have left room for redemption. Talk show hosts debated it until midnight, some praising her moral clarity, others condemning her inflexibility. The world was divided, and in that very division lay the awesome power of her choice. She had forced everyone to confront their own threshold. When does grace become enablement? And when does principle demand you build a wall? Claire Whitfield, sitting in her dim, lonely apartment, watched the press conference on a flickering television. Her face, once anonymous, was now a global symbol of arrogance. Her hands shook as Eris's words replayed, "I will not forgive contempt." Tears of self-pity streaked her face, but the world outside her window had no sympathy left to give. Eris left the podium without flourish. She did not smile. She did not wave. She returned to her suite, poured another glass of water, and sat by the window. The city of Paris glowed beneath her, indifferent yet forever changed by the events she had set in motion. She had chosen principle over platitudes, clarity over compromise. She knew history would judge her for it. Some would call her ruthless. Others would call her a revolutionary. She accepted both titles because a legacy is not shaped by pleasing all voices. It is shaped by the courage to hold one single line, even when the entire world is begging you to bend. And so the industry shifted. Airlines across continents adopted stricter, more transparent policies, not out of a sudden moral awakening, but out of a raw, bottom-line fear of the cost of producing another Eris Thorne. Government oversight deepened, lawsuits multiplied, careers ended. But from the rubble of old, complacent practices, something new began to take root. Passengers, all passengers, began to believe, perhaps for the very first time, that their dignity could no longer be denied without devastating consequence. But the story wasn't over. 1 week later, when the shell of Apex Air filed for bankruptcy, the world held its breath for the final act. In a move that shocked the global markets and redefined corporate activism, a blind trust, its funding source initially a mystery, purchased the company's remaining assets for pennies on the dollar. The next day, Eris Thorne called one last press conference. She walked to the podium, not as a victim, not as a critic, but as the new owner. "I told you I would not forgive contempt," she said, her voice ringing with the authority of a conqueror. "I am not here to forgive it. I am here to eradicate it. As the new chairwoman of this airline, which will be rebranded and rebuilt from the ground up, my first act is to announce the Dignity in Service initiative. Every employee, from the baggage handlers to the CEO, will undergo rigorous, continuous training. Oversight will be managed by an independent, passenger-led board, and a significant portion of our profits will be invested directly into the communities we have, for too long, failed to respect. We are done with apologies. We are moving on to action. Here at Black Stories Unveiled, we don't tell you what to think. We bring you the story, and we leave the questions with you. Eris Thorne chose not to forgive. She chose consequence. She chose control. She chose to tear down the house and rebuild it herself. Was it justice? Was it revenge? Or was it simply power? That is for you to decide. We tell these stories because they force us to look at ourselves, to measure our own values against the fire of real choices. Let us know in the comments what you would have done. Eris's legacy was sealed that night, not as a saint of forgiveness, not as a tyrant of revenge, but as a woman who refused to be silenced, refused to be appeased, and refused to accept that the world as it is must be the world as it has to be. She left an industry shaken, her name etched into history, and the world compelled. Because whether you agreed or disagreed, you could not look away. Her mother's words echoed one last time in her mind. Power is knowing when to be silent, and Eris, with unflinching certainty, had decided that silence had served its purpose. Now was the time to build. If this story moved you, if it made you think, make sure you are subscribed with notifications turned on. You have no idea what story we're unveiling next.